I know a lot of my listeners will want to say, I don't want to be spiritually or emotionally stunted. I want to have these opportunities to learn and grow and become somebody new. There's my motto, learn, grow, become, coming out of me again. I've got some fascination with that.
So rote.
I know, so rote. Unpacking Mormonism is a subsidiary of Daisy Girl Communications, LLC. All content herein is intended for educational purposes only and does not replace the advice or counsel of your personal care provider. Hello, and welcome back to Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma. I'm your host, Sarah Westbrook, joined with my co-host, Mason Westbrook, and our guest today, Wendi Jensen. How are you, Wendi?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here.
We've actually talked about you on our podcast, I want to say twice before. We've had people encourage them to join your Empowered Former LDS Facebook page.
Great.
And then we told a story about a post that I shared and how that tumbled into horrific family drama with Mason's family. So our listeners are aware of your name. I'm really excited for them to get to know you and hear your voice today as you instead of me bragging about you. So I'm going to let Wendi introduce herself here in a little bit, but I want to do a short recap with our listeners just to prep you as we come into this topic today. So Wendi specializes in healing. That is what she's been doing for a very long time, and I will let her fill that out a little bit later here. But I wanted to remind the listeners that one of the reasons why I feel this information is so important for you is if you remember in my story about when I left Mormonism, one of the challenges that I was facing as a licensed professional counselor was that my clients that were active Orthodox Mormons, my words are getting away from me already, and we've not even just barely started. Okay. My active Mormon clients would seem to max out their ability to heal with the evidence-based therapeutic techniques that we were working on in clinic versus my non-active LDS clients or my non-members, they've never been Mormon clients that would heal much faster. They would make the gains much faster. And then in those follow-ups, the non-member clients would be doing well out of therapy. They will have maintained the gains, happier marriages, less anxiety, less depression, doing really well, versus my LDS clients that were becoming the clients that I was seeing every week, all the time, for what I felt was seemingly small life challenges. And there was this lack, I'm going to use the word block. There seemed to be this barrier or this blockage that they could not seem to get past to work through the anxiety and depression and get down to the meat or the root of what was causing it so that they could then heal from that. And so today our goal is to, with Wendi's help, is to identify how indoctrination in high demand religions, and again, we're going to talk about Mormonism because that is our experiential expertise, but how does indoctrination stunt our emotional and spiritual development? And then as we build awareness of that process, how that can help us, that awareness can help us overcome that, how we can reframe our external experiences so that we can have increased development and growth in our personal life. Did I say that okay? Wendi, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I thought that was excellent.
All righty. Great. So I always like it when people agree with me. It makes my life easier. So, all righty. So Wendi, I would love to just turn the time over to you and let you take the wheelhouse, or take the reins today and introduce yourself and then tell us what you've got for us today.
Absolutely. Well, I am a seventh generation LDS. Well, not anymore, but I'm the one that kind of broke the chain of 7 generations of LDS indoctrination. And my belief is that it actually influences our genetic patterns and our DNA.
Absolutely.
And so I was born into this gene pool of indoctrination, and I loved it. I had a beautiful time being raised LDS. I was a little white girl, and my daddy was a bishop, and I got married in the temple at 18 and had 5 children. So I really fit the ticket for living the ideal LDS lifestyle, and I didn't have any of those red flags. I didn't have any gay children. I didn't have any mental illness. I wasn't barren. I went all the things that would kind of toss you out of the circle, so to speak, wasn't happening for me. So I didn't really have any reason to question it until I went and tried to seek help for my marriage. And I was for sure that I had figured it all out because I was doing all the right things. And I was living the gospel the way that I was taught to. I was probably the most righteous person I could think of, and I was pretty... I say this tongue in cheek because I really thought I was doing all the right things.
I think Mason can really relate to your story. Mason, what would you say about that?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Mason, why don't you go ahead and talk about that? Just the idea that Mormonism was happy and worked for you.
Well, it's interesting now seeing it from a different perspective because, yeah, I was exactly the same way. I did all those things because I wanted to. Like, I didn't feel like I was just holding up the poster. I did those things because I wanted to. I felt happy as a young priesthood holder. I was excited to go on a mission. I was excited to get married in the temple and have a family. All those things were what I wanted. And then seeing it from a different lens of just how all of that, it can, at least from one perspective, can seem also entrapping, that you're caught in this thing, and I don't know how you would ever view it that way until something, like you said, something kind of goes out of the ordinary. You have a gay child, or you have gay feelings, or, something along the lines that really throws you out of the LDS viewpoint. Then you step back and you go, okay, whoa, wait a second. And that's where you start to see this perspective of maybe I am kind of trapped where I am. I never felt that way before, but I can kind of see it now that that's some of what's going on.
Yeah, that was me. So my struggle that I was having was in my marriage. And so that's when I read a book called Remembering Wholeness, and it taught me how my thoughts and my feelings were really influencing my external experience, and it offended me because I was like, no, I'm not the one that is responsible for the turmoil in my relationship because I'm living the righteous life. And I look back now and I was just so toxic, but at the time I thought I was right on. And so in the book, she talks about a rapid eye technician. And so I looked up the nearest rapid eye technician, and there was one 20 minutes away. And so I went to her for help, and I paid a pretty penny, and I really wanted to know, how do I fix my marriage? Because it's not working. So as I went into a session with her, I explained everything that was going wrong with my husband and how righteous I was being, and I didn't deserve this terrible situation, and what is the conflict? And bless her heart, she looked at me with so much love and compassion, and she asked me one question, and I let it rest within me. And that's why I'm really a big proponent on asking deep and penetrating questions, because the one that she asked me, I let it go into me deeply. And that was, Wendy, do you ever feel like you're superior? And I was like, oh, first, that hurts really bad because I don't like people who act superior. That could possibly be me. And then I let it go in, and then I said, oh my gosh, yeah, I think I'm the best at everything. I try the hardest. Nobody tries harder than me. And I just could line up in all the ways that I was excelling better than everyone else. Mm-hmm. And then I started crying. I said, I don't want to see this about me. I don't want to own it about me. It's so ugly. I don't want to be that person. And so she soothed me and said, you know what? Superiority is a more complex form of inferiority.
Oh, I love that, because one of the things that's so fascinating about disease processes in my field, such as like narcissistic personality disorder, narcissists have, a superiority complex, but they put everybody else down, building themselves up. But underneath that, every single one that's been willing to work with is deep, deep insecurity and fear. And they're using this false sense of self-confidence and I'm the best at everything to cover up that vulnerability. So I absolutely love that. Is rapid eye technician, is that anything similar to what we call EMDR in my field? Is it where you move your eyes back and forth as you process things?
Absolutely.
There's a lot of crossover in our fields for sure.
Yeah. That was, and that day she really held some gorgeous space for me. I just felt safe to be that vulnerable, to admit that ugly, yucky part of me. And she held that space and explained inferiority. And I said, yeah, that is me. I'm never good enough. I'm constantly trying to prove that I'm a good girl. I want people to see that I'm capable and that they can depend on me. And underneath all that is that I'm not dependable and I'm not good enough and I'll never be good enough. And so I put up this facade, and she did the processes on me and really had, the rapid eye movement, lifted a lot of emotion out. And just in that moment, I thought, this is a space that I want to create for others. I want to do what she did for me today, because it was so relieving.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the one word that really stuck out to me in what you had to say was that you felt like you had to prove that you were a good girl, right? I don't necessarily see anything wrong with striving to be the best person that you can be, right? We most of us, maybe not most of us, a lot of us want to do that. Most of us are doing the best that we can do. So the idea that you had to not only be the best you could be, but prove that you were the best, it seems unsustainable. And eventually you're going to get to a point where you have mental illness, you have some breakdowns, you start to recognize and demonstrate that you can't hold up this facade of I'm trying to prove that I am good enough.
Yeah, thank you, Mason. I agree with that. I also want to say that's such a common place to be in Mormonism. We claim that we don't believe our works will save you, but then the culture and what we actually do, the better you are, the more you get. I mean, there's a status quo. I remember when Mason was called to be the bishop, there was this, I could feel it, elevation of our whole family, that now we were better because Mason was the bishop. I was the bishop's wife. Look at the bishop's kids. Look how good they are, except our special needs kids. The bishop's kids that everybody's like, look how great they are. But then the youth leaders are going, oh my gosh, the Westbrook kids. That's just, there's this elevation, there's this expectation that you have to suddenly live up to. But people are striving. So many people in Mormonism are striving to get to those positions of elevation because it's an outward sign that you're doing it right. And it's such a false narrative. It crumbles so quickly.
Yeah. Well, and I also felt, as we did more work together, this intense belief that I needed to be righteous in order to get my family to the celestial kingdom. And I didn't want to ever be a stumbling block for them, for us to be, everybody at the table, all right. Seats at the table. And the thought of losing my children was so devastatingly underneath that fueled all my efforts at perfectionism and the scrupulosity and all the trying to be worthy and trying to make my kids worthy and help them want to be worthy and want to be perfect, because we wanted to be together as a family again. The thoughts of being separated caused so much anxiety for me.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure. That's a heavy, heavy burden for one person to hold by themselves.
Yeah. And you can imagine pressure I put on my husband to be a righteous priesthood holder and to toe that high expecting line that I had drawn for him. And so it's no wonder that the marriage was falling apart, now in retrospect. But that's kind of where I got into the field of the healing arts and holding that space for others and helping them identify mind viruses. However, I was still in that field 10 years before it really started to unpack at a deeper level for me, for the same reasons that you express, is that the healing wouldn't stick and people are struggling with what seem to be really simple things to overcome. And I started writing a book and doing the research for somatic healing, and it's called the Healing Questions Guide. And you go through the different symptoms that are going in your body and identify the beliefs and the emotions that correspond to those dysfunctions in the body. And as I was doing this research and I completed the book, I realized that everything in the book, that everything that's going chaotic in the body, and there's of course exceptions to this, had some link to contempt against the self. Because in the healing arts, we believe that your emotions and your thoughts are informing your body at a cellular level. Yeah. And so in that place, I realized contempt against the self, some form of contempt against the self, creates disease and dysfunction in the body. And so I asked myself the penetrating question, Wendy, where was the first time that you learned to have contempt against yourself?
So I want to pause you for just a second. I want to put a plug in here that, you're talking about your personal research, but I would say that over the last 20, 30 years, the research that supports that across all medical fields is substantial, that we know that the greatest cause of disease process is stress. It's cardiovascular issues because of our emotional well-being, and that as we are able to really lean into things, you used the word, Wendy, the somatic. And when I was growing up, if you had somatic symptoms, the idea was that you were faking it. And we know now that that is simply not true. This is not you're faking something, or they'd say, oh, it's all in your head. And no, that's not what it means. It means that our health concerns are showing up in our body at a very physical way, something that can be tracked, something that we can see on a monitor, on a computer, as healing progresses. And now, as there has been that shift in our modern day medical world, we are seeing doctors start to lean more into natural healing and spiritual opportunities and mental and emotional health opportunities for healing. I love how the healing arts, at least what I'm seeing in the United States, are beginning to merge and come back together. And now medical science is beginning to recognize somatic symptoms mean there's not an underlying organic issue necessarily. Like you don't have a tumor, but your pain is explained by overwhelming stress and an imbalance of your hormones and whatnot. So somatic issues are gaining credibility rather than being this negative term of stop faking it and man up.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And really connecting the mind and the body together and seeing how the body reacts and responds to our emotions and to trauma.
Yeah.
We've gained so much in understanding trauma and childhood trauma. And so at this epic moment in my life, I realized that the very idea that caused contempt against myself was a story about Jesus. And I don't mean to offend anybody who is Christian or practicing Christian. But for me, the way the story was told me is that this lovely man, the most lovely of us all, had to die a violent and gruesome death on a cross to pay the price for my sins, whether I had done it up to that point or something that I so vile that I would do in the future, that he had to die this death for me. Mm-hmm. And what that did is map onto myself that there's something so vile about me that most violent thing had to happen because of something that I would do or for who I was.
Yeah, I love that. We did an episode earlier on, and I don't think in that episode we really got that point across that you've so eloquently stated, but it was you cannot have a positive relationship with the divine when the divine is your whipping boy. When every time I do something wrong, they get beat up because either I don't have any respect for that person, or every time they're getting beat for me, it creates, I like that you're using that word, contempt. I also like the word contempt because in John and Julie Gottman's curriculum for couples therapy and counseling, what I use in my clinic, contempt is the greatest predictor for relationship failure. And so when you're talking about, I felt contempt of the self, we're talking about the relationship with you. Your relationship with yourself is failing because of feelings of contempt.
There's something that we listened to recently on a Mormon Stories podcast. It was actually about silencing women's voices, which we just did a podcast about. But one of the things that he said in there is that the church needs you to feel broken. And it's interesting because, of course, it's a paradigm shift again, right? The idea of Jesus used to be so incredibly uplifting and healing. And for a lot of people, it still is, right? Like you said, I don't want to take that away from anybody either. If you find that peace through Jesus, I think that's wonderful. And I want you to feel that peace. But when you kind of change that paradigm, you also start to see how much that idea ingrains in us the idea that we're broken or that we're not good enough or that we'll never be good enough on our own. And that creates a power differential. We don't stand on equal ground with anyone because of the need that we have for, in this case, a savior, but for anybody to be that healing part. It would be just as difficult in a marriage, if you're so incredibly dependent upon your spouse that you cannot manage on your own, then that's not really a very healthy relationship. You can be together and want to be together, but if you have to be together, otherwise you're going to fall apart, that's not really healthy.
It creates a codependency on God.
Yes.
And it puts God really far out in the picture, and then this desperate attempt to try to be worthy to reconcile my relationship with my Creator. And it as much as I was told I was loved and chosen and beloved by God, on the other hand, I was also trying desperately to earn his affection, his approval, and to feel that peace and surety that just never came for me.
Yeah, that is the result of toxic perfectionism. It doesn't matter how perfect you are. It's never enough, and somebody is always paying the price of your lack of ability to be good enough. And it's a false paradigm. And it's damaging.
Well, I mean, it stunts our emotional growth. It stunts our spiritual growth because right at the core, the relationship you have with yourself is such a key component to your spiritual being.
Right.
And if I can't love myself until I feel the love of God, that puts me in a situation that's unattainable.
And I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. Research has demonstrated, and Brene Brown talks about this, you can't love somebody else more than you love yourself. And we see that show up over and over and over in the research, depending on, if we're talking about mothers of young children. When mothers of young children are getting rests and breaks and they're taking care of themselves and they're practicing self-care, they are able to be more patient and safe and nurturing and create healthy environments of development for their children versus mamas who are constantly burnt out and giving too much of themselves. We see this in marriages and families and parenting in the workplace, everywhere. And so it only makes sense that we would also have that same dynamic with a divine. However you define your divine, you cannot love your divine more than you love yourself. You have to take care of you.
Yeah. Well, and you have to give yourself permission to receive love.
Oh, I like that.
And if you don't feel worthy of that love,
yes,
that it doesn't matter. Even if God could just love you completely unconditionally, but you can only receive the amount and the portion that you feel worthy of. And I consistently felt unworthy. And that was so much the shame, the unworthiness, the martyrdom, the suffering equals love was just the theme of all of my LDS clients.
Yeah.
They couldn't feel loved and accepted at their core. Mm-hmm. And so it created all this other mayhem in their relationships because they have these getting and protecting behaviors, and they have all this just fear and anxiety that they can't even identify because it would go against the doctrines, and going against the doctrines we were taught was the ultimate downfall. Mm-hmm. And so to push up against the periphery of the doctrine was a dangerous place to be. But after 10 years of trying to help clients and understanding the spiritual matrix of the mind and how it influences our external environment, I started to expand beyond the traditions of the church and what was acceptable within the paradigm of the religion. And that's dangerous territory for people to go into who are in that religion, because you risk being an apostate. And is there anything worse than becoming an apostate?
Not in Mormondom. No.
Not in the Mormon world.
You're better off murdering somebody than becoming an apostate in Mormondom. And a lot of Mormons they'll say, no, that's not what we actually believe. But if you look at the way we treat people convicted of horrific crimes that devastate lives versus apostate, or I don't believe the same way you do and I'm walking away from this. It's very informational.
Yeah, so that's kind of where I started really challenging. I also started on researching cult dynamics. Mm-hmm. And it was at the time that Warren Jeffs had been captured, and they had a lot of news footage going on in interviewing women in the FLDS community. And I noticed their syntax, their cadence, and the vacancy in their eyes was all like they were just these little automatons, mm-hmm. because they're only allowed to observe a certain field of information, and it affected their very appearance. And I thought to myself, that's how we recognize each other as Latter-day Saints too. We call it this light that we have, mm-hmm. but in reality, it's a lack of complexity and diversity.
Yes, I love that you say that. Absolutely, because I agree with you. I remember watching the Warren Jeffs thing, and for me, when I watched it, I was like, they're in a constant loop of thought stopping and emotional stopping. At every step of the way, they are having to shut things down in order to survive this outside world that they have very little experience in. But I've never put that in the way that you just did about LDS individuals being able to go, oh, you must be Mormon, as being a lack of complexity and diversity. I think that is so profound and absolutely accurate.
Yeah, but we call it a shiny countenance.
Yes. What is
I call it a lack of experience.
His image in your countenance. I remember that. Oh, my voice sounds terrible.
I love that song. I sung that to my daughters, and I know all the words still.
It's a beautiful song. Like melody, and Janice Cat Perry could definitely write. She had talent in that area, but yes, some of those words are really icky. I find it interesting that Mormons find complexity and diversity dangerous, that when they run into it, they can't push past because it's natural. It's normal for our brains to resist a little bit when we come up to something that's unfamiliar. That's normal, natural, and healthy. But when I was LDS, I interpreted it as evil, unsafe, bad, rather than different.
I think that the problem with inviting things like complexity and diversity into your life is that if you feel like you're in a good place, there's no place for that. Why would I invite more difficulty into my life? Because while complexity and difficulty are not the same thing, they're often defined the same way for a lot of us, especially in Mormonism. Complexity just sounds terrible. It sounds difficult. So if you're in a place where you're happy, or at least you feel like you're happy, and being happy, feeling happy, essentially the same thing for most people. Why would you invite other stuff in? And it's only when you can step away from that and go, you know what, there's this whole world here that I'm missing out on that is maybe it is a little more difficult. You can certainly say over the last few years, your life has been far more complex than it probably was. It's been a difficult journey to go from where you were to where you are. And so if you can only see that from the lens of, why would I do that? I'm in a happy place. You're never going to walk that road. But if you can see that from the lens of, I'm not in a very good place, I've got to do something different. And then when you get down through that, then you can kind of go, oh, okay, yeah, now it makes sense.
Right. When you think you have everything, you're not going to seek for anything new because you already have everything.
Why would you challenge it? Unfortunately, as we talk about how that LDS indoctrination can stunt our emotional and spiritual growth, consider that diversity is the foundation of growth.
Yes.
And so a culture that has limited diversity has very limited growth.
Yes. I also find the limited growth comes because you've got a prescribed list. As long as you check the boxes, you will gain the greatest reward. There's no need to invite anything else in because anything other than these check marks threaten the best reward. And so because it's so narrow, because it's so prescribed, because there's an answer to every question of how you should do things. And if there isn't a direct answer, then it's pray, fast, and read your scriptures and just keep going. And what that does is it's that, like what we said about the FLDS women, it's that loop of thought stopping. I'm not allowing my brain to do its natural, normal, exploratory curiosity things that inform us, because we find in the developmental field, I remember when I started school, we stopped at some point. It went from your 0 to 1 to 2 to 4 to 6, whatever, 10, and then 45, and then 65, and then you're dead. And now they've gone through and they've increased, and they're like, no, we continue to learn and develop throughout the entire lifespan. But in order to do that, you have to be open to new information and allow that information to shift your current day perspectives. That's, like you said, Wendy, that is where growth, the birthplace of growth, the foundation of growth is diversity and complexity. I love that.
Yeah. And an institution or an ideology that resists inquiry, that doesn't encourage inquiry, is not an environment or a system focused on growth. It's focused on control.
Yes.
Control the information, control the behavior, control the thoughts.
Yes.
All that bite model, emotions.
Right. Stephen Hassan's bite model.
Yes. And so in that space, of course, we're going to be our growth and development as human beings with this vast consciousness and capacities for so much information. It limits us at a very, almost an infantile state. And we don't know it because we're surrounded with people with like minds. And we function just enough to look like and feel like we're okay.
So, and I would actually challenge that a little bit. Instead of saying infantile mindset, I put us more at an adolescent mindset, where it's we know enough to be obstinate and to dig in our heels, but we don't have enough developmental ability to see outside of ourselves. This is the closed system. This is where I'm stuck. And anything that does not serve inside this closed system. So when I'm a teenager, my focus is on myself and my immediate peers who agree with everything I say. Teens have a very difficult time with, and that's part of the developmental process. As teenagers, you're supposed to get exposed to differing opinions. And depending on the teenager, some of them will develop it more rapidly and others longer. But what we see is that they will push back and push against and fight new information and differing ideas. And as their peers begin to develop and go, oh, I like that idea, and they shift, that opens and broadens that perspective. But in the church, you're not allowed to get past that adolescent mindset of the only truth, the only thing that's good, the only thing that's healthy is what's inside this little itty bitty circle. So I grew up in Snowflake, Arizona. And Wendy, you said that you were from Sholo, Arizona.
20 minutes away, yeah.
20 minutes away. And I call Snowflake Bubbleville because it's this bubble. And when you pop that bubble for somebody in Snowflake who's not ready for that bubble to be popped, it's quite ugly. I popped the bubble at 16 and I was kicked out of the circle as a teenager because, and what was my crime? I had sex with my boyfriend and he wasn't Mormon. And oh my goodness, the shift in everything and how I got treated as an other for doing something that is age appropriate. It's so normal. And he and I had been dating the whole school year. Now, most people didn't know that because we had kept it a secret because we were afraid of getting in trouble for steady dating. But it's that bubble mindset, that adolescence. You are stuck in that. And I see that manifest in communication patterns with individuals, as I watch the ex-Mormon community, I watch their growth and development out of Mormonism. It is so much fun to watch somebody join the ex-Mormon space and watch how their comments and whatnot shift very rapidly into this place of growth over, I'm going to say 2 years would be where we go from that. We get those stages of grief and the anger and the hatred, and then slowly into these other areas, and they're finding this joy and this happiness versus the, what we like to term, the TBM Mormons or true blue Mormons who seem forever stuck in that adolescent loop. And I know, Mason, would you say that some of the recent conversations even that we've had with your family over some of our podcasting would definitely be identified as a very adolescent teenage way to approach something? And then the responses, I'm referring to like your Aunt Africa's comments. Okay, Mason's nodding. I'm not giving the microphone up. Go ahead, Wendy.
No, that's part of that waking up part and understanding and looking back and realizing that the world is more complex. It's a little bit intimidating because inside the bubble, if we want to call it a bubble, you feel like you're maxed out. I know the doctrines. I know the plan. I'm living the plan. I'm doing all of the things. So I'm maxed out here, and I feel like I'm on the top of my game. It's when I grew up in Sholo, I was homecoming princess. I was valedictorian. I was popular cheerleader. All the things, even in track, I just was shiny. And then I moved to Gilbert, which is a AAA school, and I got spanked. It was scary. I was not special. First of all, I didn't have any friends. I didn't know anyone. The cheer squad was extraordinarily competitive. And I remember getting in the stirrups to run against the South Mountain, these gorgeous Black women with their thighs up to my shoulders. Mm-hmm. And they just left me in the dust. And of course, I wasn't going to be the queen. And it was that shocking moment when I realized, oh my gosh, I don't know anything. I don't even know how to make friends because it was never demanded of me, because my friends were all within my community.
Right. They were given to you. Within the church, your friends are basically given to you. It's, here's your youth group. Here's your stake dance. We're going to organize all of these things. We're not going to expect our youth to organize anything outside of these, double dates and whatnot that are all also prescribed and pre-approved for, yes, that's an appropriate date. That's not
yeah.
And they're cute little, I don't know, I like to call them the Pinterest dates. That's what when I was growing up, I look at those as, I would call them today Pinterest dates. Now, Pinterest is way after my time, way before my time. What am I, 6? Pinterest came way after me, but as I look back on the superficial type activities that did not allow for human connection and development, and when I was a teen, I would have thought this is the way to do it, but that's because I didn't know another way.
Well, and relationally too. I didn't know how to have relationships.
Yeah.
I was, my parents were emotionally unavailable because they were so enmeshed in the church. My dad's the bishop, mom's doing all the things. Yeah. And I knew, and my children taught me this too, that I was afraid to let you know, Mom, that I didn't believe anymore, because I knew it meant more to you. And I was afraid you were going to choose the church over me.
Yeah.
And that's in those dynamics, I was emotionally unavailable to my children to share those very vulnerable feelings that they were having. So they kept it quiet. And I believe in a home where you're not allowed to diversify, there's a lot more secrets.
I think that's the scariest part of this. It's one of the things that I've learned most from Sarah is that open communication allows for you to be able to talk through all the hard things. And that is not encouraged in a high demand religion. At least not in my experience. I mean, we're all of us shaking our heads like, yeah, no, I don't think so. In my experience, that's not encouraged. Like if you went out and you were on a date and you touched a girl's breast, right? You didn't go home and tell mom and dad about that. Because they were going to take you to the bishop's office, and now you're humiliated, and now you can't take the sacrament. And so you end up in a situation where you do worse than that anyway. Like Sarah talked about what had happened in her experiences. A lot of that was because she could not talk about it with her parents. And just the idea that, well, I was afraid you might choose the church over me is an incredibly toxic idea. And that's what's so scary about these kind of high demand religions is that happens, and it happens frequently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't say I was in a, when you say worse place, that doesn't mean that because I couldn't talk to my parents about the intimacy I was experiencing with Michael, it was that intimacy went too fast for me because I didn't have anybody helping me understand the complexity of that relationship. I mean, we were 2 hormone-fueled teenagers, and it was consensual, but it was also a little too fast for me. I probably needed to put the brakes on, but I didn't have any supports to say, hey, if you're feeling like this is too fast, you need to be able to talk to Michael about that, and the two of you need to be able to say, hey, maybe we need to do some things that aren't quite so intimate this the next couple of weeks and get to know each other a little better. And then so yeah, I can say that one of the things that I've been very proud of because of my behavioral health field, this is one of those things that I did while I was a member. I kicked against that because I've got these teenagers. And for me, it was, if you want to try drugs, can we talk about it? Can we talk about safe doses and how to take care of the needles and where to do that and how to call for help and what's going to happen for you? Like, I know enough as a mom and a professional to know that kids are not gonna, they're going to get exposed to it. And that usually when they make the choice to do it, it's because they feel pressured and stuck. And so, I've talked to my kids about safe sex and, hey, if you're going to have sex, can you please not do it in the back seat of the car for the first time? I mean, that can be fun, but make sure that you are making it enjoyable for you and your partner. And if you need, I'm not going to spell out the tips and tricks because that feels a little awkward for both of us, but I will absolutely provide you healthy materials that will educate you on how to proceed so that you and your partner feel safe and that parents are, not necessarily approving, but aware of what's going on in their kid's life because you don't want to be having sex with somebody if their dad's going to come after you with a shotgun. We've got to communicate. We've got to do these things. And I can say that is one area I'm very grateful that I was a professional in because I did better with my kids than the generation before me. And I feel like I've got a very strong relationship with my older kids as they've grown into their adult lives and tried alcohol and tried marijuana and entered their sexual relationships and whatnot. I feel like it's been a lot healthier for them. And they still come to us with questions. And sometimes the questions feel really awkward. It's really awkward when you've got your grown-up man-child asking you very specific questions about sexual intimacy. That's not something I experienced growing up. But who better to ask if not me? If it's not, I don't want to ask this of my doctor and I don't know the answer. I don't want him going to Google. I want him to be able to come to somebody he trusts and be able to say, hey, is this normal? And for me to say, I think it is, or no, that's not. You probably do need to go see a doctor. Or, how do you feel about this? I mean, I remember my oldest broke up with his very first girlfriend. And the reason was because she would not stop kissing him in the hallways. And even though all of his buddies said it was cool, he didn't like it because it was making him late to class. And instead of me, razzing him or whatnot, we were able to talk to him about it's a boundary issue. It's not that you don't like the intimacy. The intimacy is great. But being on time and prepared for class is important to you, and you want to be in a relationship where somebody values your priorities, and not kissing her in the hallway does not mean you don't love her. It just means, hey, let's quick hug, quick kiss, get to class, and we can make out after the football game. So helping our kids navigate that it's been, I can speak from personal experience. I know I did that different. And I can honestly say I feel like my relationships with my adult children are so much healthier than mine ever were, for sure, but than most people in the environment that I grew up in, which would have been that Mormon community.
Well, I think parents live under a false assumption that if we entrench our children in this purity culture and make them terrified to use their sexual tools, their sexual body or their sensuality in any way, if we shame them and make them afraid of these things, that it's going to prevent future accidents. And nothing is further the truth, because really what happens is it abandons very fragile children, underdeveloped children, emotionally abandons them at a time when they need to talk about these things. They need to understand these things. And as an LDS girl, all I had to go to learn about sex was my peers.
Right.
Which
Absolutely.
is not a healthy place for a teenager to learn about sex.
Right. Well, and
so it's a false assumption. And when your kids cross that line, then they're embedded with that guilt and the shame, and they're outed of the bubble, and now they have a whole other slew of emotions they do not know how to handle or understand.
Right. And they're doing it alone.
You're alone.
Now you're alone, because since you crossed the line, the other kiddos cannot associate with you, because now you're contagious. And the other thing with that is, what I see in my clinic is that the inability to talk about human sexuality and these developmental things, I end up with people in my clinic, LDS people in my clinic, who cannot connect intimately with their spouses, because they cannot go from sex is bad and evil and shameful and this, like all of these rules and regulations and tight things, into a healthy sexual intimacy with their partners. I mean, I've got clients that have been married 60, 70 years who are afraid to try any other sexual position than missionary style, because Boyd K. Packer, or I don't remember who it was. It was McConkie in The Miracle of Forgiveness, I think is what it was. Okay, Spencer W. Kimball. It's somewhere in, yes, terrible book, but somewhere in that era, it was taught that missionary style sex was the only righteous way to do it. And I mean, I'm looking at these couples and my heart breaks for them, because they don't know how beautiful sex can be between two healthy partners without all the rules. Like, get rid of the rules and let's just experience our humanity.
Well, in my practice of coaching people who are exiting high demand religion and who are reconstructing after deconstruction, that sexuality piece is huge. Mm-hmm. Because now I understand that pleasure, which is so synchronistic with beauty, is one of our innate senses. There's nothing quite like experiencing pleasure, and pleasure was almost forbidden.
Well, because pleasure is equated with sin in Mormonism.
Yes, not realizing that in the bedroom, your desire to pleasure one another is what creates the bonding agents that keep you connected together. And I cannot tell you how many LDS women that I have spoken to that have not even achieved orgasm after 20, 30 years of being married. And to me, that is devastating. That is completely denying us access to our own sexuality. And we Absolutely. Are sexual beings, just like we're emotional beings and mental beings. And that piece, I mean, we can have a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, and maybe we should. You and I can get together. We can do this again. But I want to kind of take something you said earlier in the podcast and apply it here. You know, in that bedroom, we give pleasure, but we also have to accept being, right? We've got to accept the receiving side of being pleasured. And for a lot of people, you know, one of the things I see is it's okay to pleasure the man, but then giving that back to the woman is a no-go. Oh, I see all kinds of different things. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. And I like talking about sex. If anybody knows me, they know that I love talking about sex. Great. Mason's over here going, oh, shoot.
Oh, God, the sex talk.
Yes. But what I'm seeing, again, in my Mormon clients, there was that barrier. We would hit that barrier and we couldn't go any further. And even when I would nix, you know, healthy masturbation and other skills that are evidence-based to help people work through sexual issues, even when I nixed all of the things that would take away or that would be against the doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints inside the bedroom, those clients still could not push through that barrier. And I think a lot of it had to do with the idea that pleasure equates sinning. And that's so far from the truth, because usually when we harm others, if I was to say what's a sin, I would say sinning is when we purposefully cause undue harm to somebody else. That for neurotypical people, it doesn't feel good. We might have a momentary like, yeah, I got you, kind of like that vengeful feeling of satisfaction, but there's always that underlying poison, that natural guilt and shame when we cause harm to somebody. But when you're pleasuring somebody, when you're experiencing pleasure, that guilt and shame is not supposed to be there.
And that is, for me, that is the flip-flopping, the actual just mirroring, the opposite. And I've found this in a couple of other ideas that, like you say, pleasure equals sin. We're not taught that, but it is an unspoken agreement between most members of the church. Pleasure equals sin. But we also identify suffering equals love.
Yes. Yes, and that suffering is also the martyrdom. Like, we glorify it. You're having a really hard time. It's because you're so righteous that Satan is working against you.
Or that Jesus died and suffered on the cross because he loves you.
Yes.
All of it. It mixes in the mind these very essential emotions, and it confuses us and does not allow us to create any kind of healthy structure or a healthy arena to practice our emotions.
Well, and in Mormondom, we're also really good at just shutting emotions down completely. And so not only are we confusing what the arena is and mislabeling, this experience is we're labeling our emotions as righteous or evil, which they're informative. They're not meant to be a moral compass. Our emotions are informative. That's what I teach in my clinic. We're also not allowing people to experience their emotions without that loop of emotional stopping. So then things just fester, and then we feel terrible even though we're doing all of the right things, and we can't figure out why.
Yeah.
We get stuck.
We are abandoned at that adolescent age ourselves as grown-ups.
Yeah.
But I mean, even in the religion, we don't have any ownership of our emotions. Our positive emotions, our love, our gratitude, our joy, and our peace all come from the Savior.
Right.
And our contempt and our anger and our negativity and whatever, those negative emotions, they come from the adversary. Right. So that dissociates us from our own emotional body.
As well as our ability to be held accountable because, well, I did that or I said that because I was prompted to, and that came from God. Therefore, it doesn't matter to me that you're hurt. I did what God wanted me to do. And really, again, we're dissociating from, I had an impulsive thought in my head. I let it out without thinking about how it would affect the person receiving it. That was not appropriate of me. I'm sorry. I will do better, and let me reel that back in so that I can develop better social skills. I find it very telling that oftentimes members of high demand organizations or religions have a very difficult time creating and establishing relationships, meaningful, deep, connective relationships and friendships outside of that paradigm.
Well, and we're also, I think a part of that is that we're held responsible for other people's emotions. I don't know about you, but when I was younger, I was taught at a very young age, Wendy, I can hear the words now, bless my mom's heart, because she didn't know any better. But Wendy, do you think that would make Heavenly Father happy?
Yeah.
How Jesus feels about that. And so at a very young age, I'm taught to be conscious about about God's emotions, and that my actions influence his emotions. And the same happens when an adult child leaves the church and wants to tell their parents, they feel responsible for how their parents react, for their parents' reaction. It's my job to not disappoint you. And I heard this in a talk from Elder Holland many years ago. When I became aware of it, I was like, this is so toxic right now. And he talked about this woman who had sacrificed her whole life for her children and never complained. And just the idea that she didn't have any identity of her own, but gave her entire life to her children. Imagine what it would do for her, for you to come and tell her that you are now going to live this LGBTQ lifestyle. Or because it doesn't make sense to me at all now. Or now you're going to leave the church. All these things, that's like saying that you can't be gay and you can't leave the church because you're going to hurt your mom's feelings, and you're responsible for her feelings.
Right.
Yeah, that's a terrific point. And I think it's important to remember that being aware of people's feelings is a very important part of our lives, right? We're not saying don't have any care in the world for what they're feeling. We're simply saying, I'm not responsible for how they respond to a situation. I'm not responsible for how they feel about what I have to tell them. That doesn't mean I can't go home and say, okay, now what's the best way for me to tell mom this? Because I'm not trying to hurt her feelings. I want to address it in a way that actually allows for communication that will hopefully lead to a positive outcome from this conversation. But there's a difference between being aware of and having a care for and being responsible for. And I think that's very good. That's a very good point.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think the difference is when we're expressing the truth of who we are and what we're experiencing, and it hurts and offends other people. So we hide it and we censor our true feelings and our true thoughts because we don't want to feel the shame that we've hurt somebody, or we don't want to be responsible for how they feel. So if I tell you, Mom, I'm gay, I should not be responsible for how she feels about the fact that I'm gay. Or, Mom, I don't have a testimony of the church anymore. It's not working for me. I've expanded beyond this paradigm. I'm not trying to hurt her feelings, right? But she's going to be crushed. And we forego those conversations because we have not invested in the emotional education and emotional maturity of our family dynamics. And so we have these adult people engaging in these very fragile conversations without any kind of depth or maturity or tools to navigate it.
Right. Because in the church, again, when we emotionally stop, we are depriving ourselves of the very vital experiences that we need to develop the skill to navigate complex and difficult emotional experiences.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that's why I would say, again, we come back to that adolescent developmental phase where right before we got on the podcast, my daughter, who was at home babysitting little brother and sister, got really frustrated with one of the kiddos and sent me this, like, you have to do this because I'm not, blah, blah. And like, it was this explosive thing over a miscommunication about an iPad. Very explosive emotional response. I expect that of her. She's 14. She's learning. And my response was, when I left, I had answered that question. I'm sorry your brother got involved. Brother is not going to go back to his house because there's workers in there. If you need to take a break from brother, you need to own that. I'm teaching her. If I get that type of a response from somebody who's 40 or 45, or 60, yes, I'm concerned because they did not have a safe environment to develop the navigational tools and skills that they need to maintain healthy relationships with people you don't agree with their lifestyle, or it's different than what you expected. You know, I think for me, if one of my kids came to me and they said, hey, Mom, I'm gay, I wouldn't be disappointed. It wouldn't bother me. I would be concerned about the discrimination they would be experiencing in the workplace. But I know that I have family members who would absolutely struggle with that. And then they wouldn't want their kids to be around my gay child because apparently gay people are child molesters or whatever, all these other things. And so I think one of the reasons that an exit from Mormonism causes such family dysfunction is because the family has not had an environment with which to experience how to do this and maintain and nurture the relationship.
Yes. And that, I believe, is because the church has priority. The church and its doctrines have priority about over growth and development. That
Absolutely.
Your growth and development is only measured to the extent that it is growing and developing in the church and in the gospel and in the covenant path.
Right. How is your growth and development serving the church? It's very much what can you do for the church, not what does the church do for you.
Meanwhile, we have continual wounding. We as members, we're last to the table for treatment and therapy because we believe, if I'm saying my prayers, reading my scriptures, taking the sacrament, attending the temple, and if that's not working, then I've got to do my ministry and I've got to do this and I've got to do my calling better and read more scriptures. And that is the strategy for inner peace. And that strategy is a broken model. It's not sustainable. In fact, it's crazy making.
Yeah. Well, and you forgot family history work in there.
There's so much that we could go into. Maybe my shorts need to be a little bit longer. And maybe,
right. Because what we're doing is we're providing a distraction from the underlying issue. What's the causality? Where is the anxiety, depression, dysfunction? If you're feeling a lot of contempt, if you're feeling this underlying ickiness, what's causing that? And again, I'll just reiterate, in my clinic, when I was working with so many LDS people, because before I became fully licensed and on my own, I was under the supervision of somebody, and we very rarely saw LDS people. And so my work there, as we were measuring it, I'm watching these people like heal and become a different version of themselves and embrace new ideas. And it was so rewarding. And then when I opened my private practice for the very first time, I'm LDS. There's not an LDS counselor around. I suddenly had about 80% of my client population LDS. And I'm sitting here scratching my head going, I'm doing the same thing I did under supervision, and my results are not the same. What's wrong? And I sought lots of consultation. And what I saw was my LDS clients would not allow themselves to explore anything about how their religious practice might be harming them. They couldn't. And I'm Mormon. I'm not giving them anything that goes against their doctrine, but it is the resistance to new information, resistance to outside resources. I can't look at this. I can't do it different. And I mean, I remember telling one client, I think studying your scriptures for 3 hours a day is maybe a little too much. Can we wheel that back and maybe spend some of that other time taking care of these tasks, because you are feeling so overwhelmed on all of these things, and it's such a simple thing? And her response was, no, every time I go to the bishop, he says I need to be more diligent in my scripture study. And I'm like, does your bishop know you're doing it for 3 hours a day? Yes. And he says that's probably sufficient. And the bishop's trump. For me, that one was for me, that client, I remember just sitting here going, this is so illogical, but because they're so brainwashed, that indoctrination, that trust in an outside source telling them what is going to make them happy would stop them from being able to see what that behavior was doing and how damaging it was to their day-to-day functioning. I was not telling this person to abandon scripture reading forever. I was saying, let's pull it back to maybe 30 minutes. That gives you an extra 2.5 hours a day to keep up. And maybe we could do some, task management and time management skills and maybe some healthy exercise. And she couldn't do it. She could not step away because her bishop told her 3 hours was very good. And she was a Relief Society president.
So she had all the burden of the rest of the ward and felt responsible for their salvation on top of her own family.
And she was drowning. Yeah.
One good example that I have heard, and this comes from one of my mentors, Rodney Allgood, who serves the ex-Jehovah's Witness population. And he talks about how if you were born inside of a prison and your parents are both wearing orange jumpsuits and you get an orange jumpsuit slapped on you, you don't know any different. And you make friends with everybody in orange jumpsuits and in the prison. And if you're taught in the prison that anything outside the prison was dangerous, that you would lose your family, that you would be severed in the next life, and you would experience God's displeasure, and that you would lose the Holy Ghost, and that you would have all of these detrimental things happen to you, you would live in that environment and not need a guard. No warden is necessary.
Right.
No across that door. But when somebody does, and they look outside and they see the Technicolor world, and they go traveling and they go exploring, they're like, hey, it's really not that bad out here. I'm thriving and I'm growing and I'm having fun. And you go back to visit your family members at the prison and they're like, you know what? You need to come back. You need to come back here into what we call the gospel. You need to refine the covenant path. And I know the problems that you were having before, but it's better now. We get to have spaghetti and barbecue. It's not hot dogs every night. And you know what? We also had a great opportunity where on Saturday nights they put a movie up and we get to watch a movie outside. It's really fun.
Right.
That's how it feels when you leave and you're looking at them like, are you kidding me? I would never go back into that place because this world that I'm experiencing out here is so colorful and complex, and I'm learning and growing exponentially, and I'm not limited in my growth. But they'll look at you in their orange jumpsuits and say, you need to come back. We miss you.
Right. They look at you and say, no, that's not real happiness.
You're living
that's manufactured happiness.
And
Yes. Goodness gracious. So Wendi, what is your advice for people in this place? What are some of the resources or skills that you feel help people begin their journey to increase their development and their emotional growth? Because I know a lot of my listeners will want to say, I don't want to be spiritually or emotionally stunted. I want to have these opportunities to learn and grow and become somebody new. There's my motto, learn, grow, become, coming out of me again. I've got some fascination with that.
So rote.
I know, so rote. But how can they start their own journeys? From your expertise, what advice do you give individuals in that position?
Well, I'm surprised that the dragonfly hasn't come up. With me, the dragonfly comes up.
All right, let's bring up the dragonfly.
All the time. And I talk about the parallel of the dragonfly, and I'll maybe save that for another time because it's quite deep and complex. But I ended with these 4 things that I think are extraordinarily important. And that is to have a vision for your future. If you do not have a vision for your future, you will cycle around in the ex-LDS community, rewounding yourself and maintaining your victimhood. Yes, you were raised in a cult, or you were raised in a high-demand religion. You were religiously abused. And now what? have a vision for yourself.
I love that.
And keep your focus on that. And sometimes we get we need the validation after we come out. And I'm so grateful that people are doing this ex-LDS community work, and it's available, but we can get sucked into it and get addicted to it, actually. And it doesn't allow us to move forward. So we're still cycling in dysfunction. And so you keeping your focus on your vision, important piece. Skills, increase your skill set. Get to therapy. Understand what your attachment style is. What's your Enneagram number? What was your role in the family? Who do you play in the victim triangle? All of these, increase your vocabulary about emotional intelligence. Feel your emotions. Journal your emotions. For me, I encourage you to come to a retreat, or in my not my podcast, but my support group, Empowered Former LDS. It's focused on moving forward, and it's very supportive community. And that's the fourth one, is community. Get support from people who are moving forward. The more you're surrounded with people who are still bitter, and we have the right to be in a bitter space. We have the right to be angry.
I'm going to say you will be bitter. You will be angry. Embrace it. Lean into it. It passes as you heal, but it is very much, if I'm going to get a cut on the arm, I'm going to feel it. It's going to bleed. That is part of the process. I don't need to hide that behind my back. I'm not bitter. And I don't need to keep reopening it to demonstrate I got a cut. We've got to move through it. But yes, embrace it when it's there. Let it go when it's time to let it go.
Yes, and surround yourself with people who are moving forward, and people who are healing, and people who are focusing on creating their life without the labor and the burden of indoctrination. You've been set free, but sometimes we just keep swirling around the same swamp. And so, flare your wings up and go explore the world. There's just so much that we're denied access to when we were under the influence of indoctrination, and now we're set free, and sometimes we just keep swirling around the same places, and we never really expand because, again, we were not taught how to process the emotions, and we are in an emotional upheaval when you leave, because you realize what was done to you and how it affected you. And then the leaving part of now being shunned and alienated and shamed. It's very complex. Give yourself that healing space, but intend to move on.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you very much. I would love to invite you, Wendy, to come back at a future date. I think this has been a very fruitful conversation, very helpful. It's wonderful to hear methods of healing from another expert that uses different vocabulary and different insights. I very much come from the realm of mental health professional. That's where I've gotten my training and whatnot. And you're not coming from the LPC mindset. And there's so much overlap. We did an episode on, life coaching versus counseling. And we talked about there is healing in all of those areas. You need to be able to find what works for you and resonates the best for you. And so I absolutely love the perspective that you bring that is supportive of that healing space, using a different lens than we normally provide. I'd also love to invite you to email Mason and I the links to your books and whatnot. We will be adding those to our show notes so that our listeners can find you. And you already did it? Mason says he's already done it over here in the background. Good job, Mason. It's great person. But I want to...
At least everything we discussed, at least everything that came up in this discussion is in the show notes. So every book that you mentioned or things like that, they're all there already. So if there's other things that you would like to have us link in there, send them to me or to Sarah. We'll get them put in.
Oh, awesome.
I love our listener group because so many of them follow those links. And I get a lot of feedback and expressions of gratitude from our listenership. So I think we're at 14,300 downloads in the 4 months since we've been going. And I know it's been so exciting.
proud of you.
Thank you. It's been really exciting. But one of my favorite feedbacks is, hey, I read that book you recommended and it's changed my life. And thank you so much. And so we definitely want to make sure that we're adding your books to that resource for those people who resonate more with the way that you approach this healing place. We also want them to be able to find you. And if they feel that they want to hire you as a life coach, I want them to have access to all of those resources. So please shoot the information over that we don't already have. And then if you are listening on Spotify or Apple, or whatever podcast platform you're looking at, Wendi, and you see, hey, we've missed one, just let us know and we will add that right back in. We absolutely, we are here to help connect people with the healing resources that work best for them. So
yep, there's no competition in that space because we all understand the wound and we're just here to help, and we don't. There's so many ways to do it. Yes. Everybody resonates differently, and now we get to pick and choose rather than have one pathway. That's the only way. So
yes, that is one of my favorite things about this space is that as I connect with other influencers and podcasters and authors in this space, they are very supportive and helpful. And yes, let me do what I can to help you have your voice heard. You know, and it's growing these things in that way. And I love that because it is not something I experienced inside the church. It is something I experience in my profession. That's one of the things I love about my profession.
Let me tell you something. This is my belief. I believe that the ex-LDS community is one of the most supporting exiting religious communities. And that is one good thing we did learn inside. And there was many things we did learn that were good. Mm-hmm. But I think the community helping each other and supporting each other, now that we can do it without contingencies and without limitations, that beautiful thing that we learned in the church, we're creating a very strong and diverse community. And I'm grateful for that.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. Mason and I are going to be doing an upcoming episode here on the good things that we learned in Mormonism.
Oh, good.
Because there are some great things, and very few of them are exclusive to Mormonism, but that is where we got those lessons and it shaped our lives. So thank you again so much for joining us today. We'll have to connect and would love to have you back to hear about the dragonfly that you spoke about. I don't think I've heard that from you yet, so I'm excited to learn what that is. I'll have to touch base with you and go from there. Alrighty. Once again, listeners, thanks so much for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments or feedback, please feel free to shoot me an email at daisygirlcommunications@gmail.com. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma is hosted by me, Sarah Westbrook, and my husband, Mason Westbrook. Produced by Daisy Girl Communications and Alex Vidalis. Our music today was Moving Forward by Run to Life.